Everyone laughed when he built a cave into his cabin, until it stayed warm all winter. Martin never planned to impress anyone when he bought the cabin. In fact, the reason he chose that place was because almost no one else wanted it. The cabin sat deep in the northern woods, far from the main road, surrounded by tall pine trees and a long, sloping hillside behind it. It was old, weathered, and clearly neglected. The roof sagged slightly, the windows rattled in the wind, and the wooden walls showed decades of wear. Most people who saw it shook their heads and said the same thing. It was fine for summer, but no one in their right mind would stay there during winter. Martin had heard all of that before. He was in his early 40s, quiet by nature and not the type to argue. He had worked for many years as a construction laborer, moving from site to site, fixing things that others designed. Over time, he grew tired of noise, deadlines, and crowded places. He wanted something simple, a place where he could work with his hands, think clearly, and live without constant pressure. The cabin gave him that chance, even if it came with challenges. From the first day he moved in, people were curious about what he was doing there. Neighbors lived miles apart, but news still traveled fast in a small rural area. They knew winters that were harsh. Snow could pile up for months, and temperatures often stayed below freezing. Heating costs were high, and power outages were common. Several owners before Martin had tried living there year-round and failed. Most gave up after 1 or 2 winters. When Martin started fixing the cabin, people assumed he would install a new heating system. Some suggested electric heaters, others recommended propane or a modern wood stove. Martin listened politely but never committed to any of it. He nodded, thanked them, and went back to his work. What caught everyone's attention was not what he added to the cabin, but what he started removing from the ground behind it. A few weeks after settling in, Martin brought out basic digging tools. Shovels, pickaxes, and buckets appeared near the hillside. At first, people thought he was just clearing space or fixing drainage. Then the hole grew deeper. Day after day, he dug into the earth behind the cabin, carving out a narrow opening that slowly expanded inward. From the outside, it looked strange. The cabin already struggled against the cold, and now he was spending hours digging into frozen soil. Neighbors who passed by on snowmobiles or trucks slowed down to watch. Some laughed quietly, others openly. A few asked him what he was building. Martin usually answered with short, calm replies. He said he was making space or working on insulation. That only confused people more. Insulation usually meant adding materials, not removing dirt. Someone joked that he was building a cave like something from ancient times. Another said he must be planning to hide from winter instead of facing it. The laughter was not cruel, but it was constant. In a place where everyone depended on shared knowledge to survive harsh conditions, doing something different attracted attention. People believed they already knew what worked. They trusted furnaces, stoves, and fuel deliveries. Digging into a hill seemed backward, outdated, and risky. Martin noticed the reactions, but they did not stop him. He had spent years reading and learning quietly. Old building methods interested him, especially those that relied on nature instead of fighting it. He knew that underground spaces stayed cooler in summer and warmer in winter. The earth held a steady temperature that machines could not easily match. This was not an experiment to him, it was a carefully thought-out plan. As he dug deeper, the shape of the space became clearer. It was not just a hole. He reinforced the walls, smoothed the ceiling, and paid attention to airflow. He worked slowly and carefully, often alone. Some evenings, after hours of digging, he would sit outside the cabin and look at the hillside, thinking about small adjustments he would make the next day. People continued to doubt him. A few warned him about safety. Others said moisture would ruin everything. Some insisted he was wasting his time and energy when winter was getting closer. Martin thanked them for their concern but kept going. He believed that rushing would cause mistakes, and he could not afford that. As autumn approached, the forest changed colors. Leaves fell and the air grew sharper. The hole behind the cabin was now clearly a cave-like structure, connected close to the back wall of the cabin. To outsiders, it still looked unfinished and strange. To Martin, it was taking shape exactly as planned. What no one else understood was that Martin was not trying to prove anything. He was not interested in being right or wrong in front of others. He simply wanted a home that worked. A home that stayed warm without constant fuel, noise, or stress. He trusted patience, observation, and methods that had survived long before modern systems existed. By the time the first light snow fell, the laughter had faded into quiet curiosity. People still doubted him, but they also wondered. Martin continued working, calm and focused, as winter slowly approached. No one knew it yet, but the idea they laughed at was about to be tested in the hardest way possible. As the days grew shorter, the attention around Martin's cabin did not fade. In fact, it grew stronger. The hole in the hillside was no longer something people could ignore. It had become a topic of regular conversation at the local store, at fuel stations, and during long talks between neighbors preparing for winter. Everyone had an opinion, and most of them were filled with doubt. Some said Martin was being stubborn. Others believed he was trying to prove he was smarter than everyone else. A few thought he simply did not understand how dangerous winter could be in that area. People had lived there for generations, and they trusted experience more than ideas. To them, heat came from fire, fuel, and electricity. Dirt and stone were for foundations, not comfort. When Martin drove into town to buy supplies, he noticed the looks. They were not angry, just curious and skeptical. Someone would ask, "How's the cave coming along?" followed by a small laugh. Another would warn him again about freezing pipes or trapped moisture. Martin always responded calmly. He never defended himself strongly. He knew words would not change minds. Only results could do that. Back at the cabin, his work became more detailed. The digging phase slowed down, replaced by careful shaping and reinforcing. He lined certain sections with stone he collected nearby. He sealed cracks and tested how air moved through the space. Every decision was deliberate. If something felt wrong, he stopped and corrected it. He had learned over the years that small mistakes could grow into serious problems if ignored. Rain became more frequent as autumn settled in. Neighbors expected the cave to flood or collapse. After heavy storms, some even drove past just to see if the hillside had caved in. It never did. Martin had planned for water flow, guiding it away from the structure. The ground stayed firm, and the inside remained dry. Still, the doubts continued. One evening, an older neighbor named Paul stopped by. Paul had lived in the area his entire life and had seen many people come and go. He stood quietly near the cave entrance, studying it without laughing. After a long pause, he asked Martin why he was doing it. Martin did not give a long explanation. He spoke simply. He said the earth held heat. He said older cultures had used it for centuries. He said modern systems worked, but they depended on things that could fail. He wanted something steady. Paul nodded slowly but said nothing more. Before leaving, he warned Martin that winter would be the real test. Martin agreed. He already knew that. As the temperature dropped, the pressure increased. People stocked up on firewood and fuel. Conversations shifted from curiosity to concern. Some believed Martin would change his mind at the last minute and install a heater like everyone else. Others thought he would leave before the first deep freeze. Instead, Martin focused more intensely on finishing the connection between the cave and the cabin. He created a sealed passage that allowed air to move gently without letting cold drafts rush in. He tested it again and again, adjusting small details. He slept lightly, waking in the night to check temperatures and airflow. Inside the cabin, changes were noticeable. Even without heavy heating, the air felt more stable. The sharp cold that usually crept in at night seemed weaker. Martin noticed that mornings were less bitter than before. These were small signs, but they encouraged him. Still, doubt followed him everywhere. One afternoon, a group of locals stopped near the cabin while passing through. They joked openly this time, asking if he planned to live underground like an animal. Martin smiled politely and returned to his work. He had learned not to take such comments personally. People laughed at what they did not understand. As the first real snow arrived, it covered the ground in a thick, quiet layer. The forest changed completely. Sounds became softer and the world felt slower. Most people stayed indoors, tending fires and checking weather reports. Martin continued working, though his pace slowed as the cold hardened the soil and stiffened his hands. Nights grew colder, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and made silence feel heavy. Martin noticed that while the outside temperature dropped sharply, the cave remained steady. It was not warm like a fire-lit room, but it was calm and consistent. That consistency mattered. Word spread that Martin was still there, still working, still sleeping in the cabin. Some thought he was being reckless. Others quietly admired his determination, even if they did not agree with his method. But no one expected success. Most believed it was only a matter of time before he gave up. Martin felt the weight of those expectations, but he did not let them distract him. He reminded himself why he started. He did not want to battle winter every year. He wanted to live with it. He trusted the process, even when uncertainty crept in during the coldest nights. As winter settled in fully, the laughter faded into silence. People stopped joking and started watching. They waited for the moment when Martin would pack up and leave. They believed it was inevitable. What they did not see was the quiet confidence building inside the cabin. The cave was doing exactly what it was meant to do. And while no one else realized it yet, the real test had already begun. Winter arrived without warning, the way it always did in that region. One morning, Martin woke up to a world buried in white. Snow covered the cabin roof, the trees bowed under its weight, and the narrow path to the road had vanished. The air outside was sharp and biting, the kind that made breathing feel heavy. This was the season everyone had warned him about. This was the season they believed would force him to leave. Inside the cabin, Martin sat quietly near the back wall, listening. There was no loud heater running, no constant crackle of a large fire. The silence felt strange but peaceful. He placed his hand against the wooden wall near the cave connection. It felt cool but not cold. That small detail told him something important. The temperature inside was holding steady. The first few days of deep winter were about observation. Martin paid close attention to everything. He checked the airflow between the cave and the cabin multiple times a day. He watched for moisture, listened for unusual sounds, and measured the temperature morning and night. Outside, the cold was unforgiving. Inside, the change was slow and gentle. At night, the temperature dropped far below freezing. Winds pushed against the cabin, rattling the windows and whistling through the trees. In other homes nearby, heaters worked non-stop. People woke up to frozen pipes, drained fuel tanks, and rising costs. Martin lay in bed, fully dressed at first, unsure what to expect. But as hours passed, the cold never reached him the way he feared. The cave was doing its work quietly. The earth around it held warmth from earlier months and released it slowly. The air moving from the cave into the cabin softened the sharp chill that usually filled the space. It was not perfect comfort, but it was enough. More importantly, it was steady. A week passed. Then another. Snowstorms came and went. Roads closed. Power lines failed in some areas. Martin heard about it on a small radio he used sparingly. He noticed that while others worried about outages, he felt less dependent on things outside his control. That gave him a sense of calm he had not felt in years. People began to notice his absence from town. He was not coming in for fuel. He was not asking for help. Curiosity replaced doubt. A few neighbors drove out after a storm, expecting to find the cabin empty or damaged. Instead, they saw smoke rising gently from the chimney, not from heavy use, but just enough to help during the coldest hours. One afternoon, Paul returned. He trudged through the snow and knocked on the cabin door. Martin welcomed him inside. Paul looked around slowly, noticing the quiet warmth. He removed his gloves and held his hands out, surprised. "It's warmer than I expected," Paul said. Martin nodded. He offered him tea warmed on a small stove. Paul asked questions this time, not mocking ones, but careful ones. How steady was the temperature? Did it change at night? What about storms? Martin answered honestly. He explained that it was not luxury warmth, but it was reliable. He said reliability mattered more to him than comfort. Paul left thoughtful, saying little. That evening, Martin noticed something else. The laughter had stopped. People were no longer joking about the cave. They were watching quietly now. As winter deepened, the real challenges appeared. One night, the temperature dropped lower than it had in years. The cold pressed hard against the cabin. Martin woke up and felt the air. It was colder than usual, but still manageable. He adjusted a small vent, something he had planned for. Slowly, the temperature stabilized again. That moment tested his confidence. He sat awake for hours, listening to the wind. Doubt crept in. He wondered if he had miscalculated something. He wondered what would happen if the cold lasted too long. But by morning, the cabin remained standing, and the warmth had not disappeared. Snow piled up against the hillside, covering the cave entrance completely. Some people believed this would end everything. They thought airflow would stop, moisture would build, and the system would fail. Martin had planned for this too. The entrance was protected, and airflow came from deeper paths, not the surface. Inside, nothing changed. Weeks passed. Martin settled into a routine. He chopped minimal wood, cooked simple meals, and spent time reading or repairing small things. The cabin felt different now. Less like a temporary shelter, more like a true home. News traveled fast. People talked about how Martin had not left, how he seemed comfortable, how his cabin stayed usable even during the worst storms. Some still doubted quietly, waiting for failure. Others began to feel something else, respect. One evening, as snow fell steadily outside, Martin sat near the cave entrance and reflected. He remembered the laughter, the warnings, the looks. He had not argued with anyone. He had not tried to convince them. He simply trusted his work. The cave did not look impressive. It was not modern or flashy. But it worked. It proved that understanding nature could be more powerful than fighting it. By the middle of winter, it was clear that Martin was not leaving. The cave had passed its hardest test so far. And as the cold continued outside, a quiet realization began to spread through the valley. The idea they once laughed at was no longer something to joke about. It was something to learn from. By the time winter reached its deepest point, the valley felt different. The cold was still there, the snow still thick, but something had changed in the way people talked. The jokes about Martin and his cave had disappeared completely. In their place were quiet questions and careful conversations. People were no longer waiting for him to fail. They were trying to understand how he was still living so calmly while everyone else struggled. Martin noticed the change without anyone saying it directly. More tracks appeared near his cabin after storms. Neighbors drove by slowly, sometimes stopping at a distance just to look. A few even waved instead of shaking their heads. He remained focused on his routine, but he could feel the shift in attitude. The cave continued to perform steadily. The temperature inside the cabin stayed balanced, even during long stretches of extreme cold. Martin still used a small amount of firewood on the coldest nights, but nothing like the constant burning others relied on. He felt less tired, less stressed. His days were quiet and simple, exactly what he had hoped for when he chose this life. One morning, after a heavy snowfall, Martin heard footsteps outside. When he opened the door, he found two neighbors standing there, both bundled up and clearly cold. They looked unsure, almost embarrassed. After a moment of silence, one of them asked if they could come in for a few minutes. Inside, they removed their gloves and stood near the back wall, surprised by the steady warmth. They asked questions, slowly at first. How long had it taken to build? Was it expensive? Did it really work all the time? Martin answered patiently. He did not exaggerate or brag. He explained the limits as well as the strengths. He made it clear that the cave was not magic. It simply worked with the land instead of against it. Word spread quickly after that visit. More people stopped by in the following days. Some came out of curiosity, others out of need. A few had heating problems or power issues and needed a place to warm up for a short while. Martin never turned anyone away. He offered warm drinks and quiet conversation. The cabin became a place of calm in the middle of a harsh season. With each visit, respect grew. People began asking serious questions now, not joking ones. They wanted to know how the earth held heat, how airflow mattered, and how planning made the difference. Martin shared what he knew, always reminding them that patience was the most important part. Rushing, he said, caused more problems than cold ever did. The turning point came during the coldest week of the winter. Temperatures dropped to levels that worried even the most experienced locals. Fuel deliveries were delayed. Power outages lasted longer than usual. Stress spread across the valley. People checked on each other more often, knocking on doors and offering help. During that week, Martin's cabin became a quiet example of stability. While others struggled to maintain heat, his remained steady. It was not perfect comfort, but it was safe and reliable. People noticed. They talked about it openly now, without doubt or disbelief. One evening, Paul returned again. This time, he stayed longer. They sat near the cave entrance, listening to the wind outside. Paul admitted that he had laughed at the idea at first. He said he had never thought something so simple could work so well. Martin listened without judgment. He understood that change was hard, especially when it challenged long-held beliefs. Paul asked if Martin would help others build something similar when winter ended. Martin did not answer right away. He thought about it carefully. He said he would help, but only if people were willing to learn and take their time. He did not want shortcuts to ruin something that required understanding. As winter slowly began to loosen its grip, the cave stood as quiet proof of what was possible. Martin did not feel proud in the way people expected. He felt peaceful. His goal had never been to prove others wrong. He simply wanted a home that worked in harmony with its surroundings. The laughter that once followed him had turned into respect. The silence that once felt lonely now felt shared. People who once doubted him now nodded in understanding when they passed his cabin. The cave, once seen as foolish, had become a symbol of calm thinking and steady effort. As days grew slightly longer and the cold softened just enough to notice, Martin realized something important. The hardest part had never been the digging or the cold. It had been trusting his idea when no one else did. And now, as winter slowly prepared to end, that trust had been rewarded in a way he never expected. By the time winter reached its deepest point, the valley felt different. The cold was still strong, the snow still heavy, but the way people spoke had quietly changed. The laughter that once followed Martin's name was gone. In its place were soft questions, careful looks, and long pauses of thought. People were no longer waiting for him to fail. They were trying to understand how he was still living calmly while they were fighting the cold every single day. Martin noticed the change without anyone saying it directly. Fresh tracks appeared near his cabin after each storm. Vehicles slowed as they passed his place. Sometimes someone stopped at a distance, pretending to check something, but really just watching. A few even waved. That never happened before. Martin returned the wave and went back to his work, but inside he understood that something important was shifting. The cave continued to do exactly what it was built to do. The temperature inside the cabin stayed steady, even during long nights of extreme cold. Martin still used a small fire during the harshest hours, but nothing compared to the constant burning others needed. He slept better now, his body felt less tense, his mind felt clear. The quiet life he had hoped for was finally real. One morning after a heavy snowfall, Martin heard footsteps crunching outside his door. When he opened it, two neighbors stood there, bundled tightly, their faces tired from the cold. They looked uncertain, almost embarrassed to be there. After a moment, one of them asked if they could come inside for a few minutes. Martin stepped aside and welcomed them in. As soon as they entered, their shoulders relaxed. They removed their gloves and stood quietly, surprised by the warmth. They did not speak at first, they simply felt it. Then the questions came. How long did it take to build? Did it cost a lot? Was it safe? Did it really work all winter? Martin answered slowly and honestly. He explained that it took patience more than money. He explained that planning mattered more than speed. He made it clear that the cave was not perfect or effortless. It required thought, care, and respect for the land. But yes, it worked. After that visit, everything changed. Word spread quickly. More people came by over the next few days. Some were just curious. Others had heating troubles or power issues and needed a warm place to rest. Martin welcomed them all. He offered warm drinks, quiet conversation, and a place to sit. He never acted proud. He never said he had been right. He simply shared what he had learned. The cabin became a small gathering point during the hardest weeks of winter. People talked there not just about the cave, but about their own struggles, about rising costs, long nights, and the stress of depending on systems that failed too easily. Martin listened more than he spoke. His calm presence made people feel at ease. With each visit, respect grew. The questions became more serious now. People asked about airflow, earth temperature, and planning. They wanted to understand, not just observe. Martin explained in simple terms. He reminded them that nature already provided balance if people were willing to learn from it. Fighting the environment, he said, often caused more problems than it solved. The true turning point came during the coldest week of the winter. Temperatures dropped lower than anyone remembered. Fuel deliveries were delayed. Power outages lasted longer than usual. Worry spread through the valley. People checked on one another more often, knocking on doors and sharing supplies. During that week, Martin's cabin stood steady. While others struggled to keep their homes warm, his remained usable and safe. It was not luxury comfort, but it was reliable. That reliability mattered. People talked about it openly now. No jokes, no doubt. Paul visited again during that week. This time, he stayed for hours. They sat near the cave entrance, listening to the wind outside. Paul admitted that he had laughed at the idea at first. He said he had never believed something so simple could work so well. Martin listened without judgment. He understood how hard it was to accept ideas that challenged long-held beliefs. Paul asked if Martin would help others build something similar once winter ended. Martin thought carefully before answering. He said he would help, but only if people were willing to learn properly and take their time. He warned against shortcuts. He believed that rushing would only lead to disappointment. As winter slowly began to loosen its grip, the cave stood as quiet proof of what careful thinking could achieve. Martin did not feel proud in the way people expected. He felt peaceful. His goal had never been to prove anyone wrong. He simply wanted a home that worked in harmony with the land. The laughter that once followed him had turned into respect. The silence that once felt lonely now felt shared. People who once doubted him now nodded in understanding when they passed his cabin. The cave, once seen as foolish, had become a symbol of patience, balance, and quiet determination. As the days grew slightly longer and the cold softened just enough to notice, Martin realized something important. The hardest part had never been the digging or the winter. It had been trusting his idea when no one else did. And now, as winter slowly prepared to end, that trust had changed not just his life, but the way an entire valley looked at possibility. When the first signs of spring finally appeared, they felt almost unreal. Thin streams of water formed where snow had once been solid and endless. The air still carried a sharp chill, but it no longer felt heavy or threatening. For the first time in months, the valley breathed a little easier. Winter had not disappeared yet, but everyone could feel that its hold was weakening. Martin noticed the change early. He woke one morning to sunlight reflecting off melting snow instead of gray clouds. The cabin felt the same inside, steady and calm, but outside the forest was waking up. Birds returned slowly. Branches shook free of ice. The long silence of winter softened. He stepped outside and looked at the hillside behind his cabin. The cave entrance, once buried under snow, was now visible again. It looked unchanged, strong, quiet. It had done its job without complaint. Martin felt a deep sense of gratitude, not pride, but appreciation. The cave had been an idea, but patience and trust had turned it into something real. People began visiting more often as roads cleared. This time they were not just stopping to warm up. They came to talk. They came to learn. Some brought notebooks. Others brought questions they had been holding on to all winter. Martin welcomed them the same way he always had, calmly, without acting like a teacher or expert. He explained what he could in simple words. He showed them how the earth held temperature, how airflow mattered more than force, and how planning saved effort later. He repeated one thing often: the cave worked because it respected the land. It did not fight it. As days passed, conversations spread beyond his cabin. People talked at the store, at road crossings, and during shared meals. The cave became a symbol, not just of warmth, but of thinking differently. It made people question how many problems they were fighting instead of understanding. One neighbor decided to try a small earth storage space near his home. Another began redesigning a shed with better insulation using natural methods. No one rushed. They remembered Martin's warning about shortcuts. Winter had taught them all something about patience. Martin did not charge money or seek attention. He helped where he could and stepped back when needed. He believed that ideas grew best when people made them their own. Watching others learn was enough for him. By late spring, the snow had almost fully disappeared. The ground softened, and the valley looked alive again. Martin spent time repairing parts of the cabin that winter had worn down. He reinforced areas that needed it and improved small details in the cave, not because it had failed, but because he wanted it to last for many years. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Paul stopped by once more. They sat outside this time, no longer hiding from the cold. Paul looked around and smiled. He said the valley felt different now, not because of the weather, but because people felt more confident, more capable. Martin understood. The cave had not just kept him warm. It had shown others that solutions did not always need to be loud or expensive. Sometimes they needed time, trust, and quiet effort. As summer approached, life slowly returned to normal rhythms. But something had changed beneath the surface. People no longer laughed at unfamiliar ideas so quickly. They listened more. They asked questions. They remembered how wrong they had been once. Martin continued living in his cabin just as quietly as before. He did not become famous. He did not seek recognition. He found peace in routine, in steady temperatures, and in the knowledge that he had built something meaningful. When the next winter eventually came, it was no longer feared the same way. People were better prepared. They had learned from experience. And at the center of that change was a simple cave carved into a hillside by a man who trusted his idea when no one else did. The story of Martin spread beyond the valley over time, changing slightly with each telling. Some focused on the cave. Others focused on the winter, but those who truly understood knew the real lesson was deeper. It was about patience over noise, thought over habit, and the quiet strength of believing in something long enough to see it work. Martin never corrected the stories. He smiled and listened, because in the end he did not build the cave to be remembered, he built it to live, and that simple choice changed everything.